clicked. Okay, is that live?
Okay, welcome everybody to today's event, which will deal with post-colonial views on anti-Semitism. South Africa as an example. We have today three speakers at the panel. We're very happy. We have, on the one hand, we have Karen Milner, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at Wits University and Chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Then, who just joined us, it's Klaas Mokgomole. He coordinates the organization Africans for Peace, which is a collective of independent students and scholars and activists who bring an African lens to the global debate on peace and stability in Africa and around the world. And thirdly, we have Benji Shulman with us, who is the head of public policy for the South African Zionist Federation, which works on the connection between Israel and the South African Jewish community. So I'm very happy to have you all today with us. Like it will be a conversation, international conversation between here in Germany and South Africa. This event is the second event which we hold. This event is co-organized between our institute, the International Institute for Education Research on Anti-Semitism, based in Berlin, as well as the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, which is also based in Berlin. Both organizations are active also on a national level and to a different extent also on an international level. So very happy to have you here with us today. So one background why we started to organize this conversation is in Germany, as you know, we have a strong memory of the Holocaust, the intentional murder of 6 million Jews, coordinated, executed by the German state and its allies. And over the past years, the German colonial past became a much more role, which is very important, and we think we appreciate. And at the same time, it started to, on the one hand, two developments. On the one hand, kind of competing discourse in some cases between a post-colonial perspective, or to speak about the colonial past in Germany, Europe, and on the other hand, the Holocaust, memory on the Holocaust. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, we noticed in Germany that over the last decade, which is also reflected on an international level, often individuals and organizations claiming that they have a post-colonial view and are based on post-colonial theory, sometimes in different extents, of course, hold anti-Semitic views, promote anti-Semitic worldviews, specifically being expressed in hatred against the state of Israel, sometimes the existence of the state of Israel. Sometimes it goes not just against the Jews living in Israel, but against all the Jews. Sometimes it's being connected with conspiracy theories, sometimes it's not. So this is a little bit the background of the German conversation. And two individuals played a major role from South Africa over the last couple of years. It was on the one hand Farid Esak, and on the other hand Achille Mbembe, who were to different extents, discussed also in German feuilleton, and in the broader cultural arena. So in the same time, we are witnessing these discussions. The discussion has been connected to a discussion on boycotts of Israel, if it's justified or not. So what we thought, why we started to organize the event, is on the one hand, of course, we want to learn about this and the different perspectives you might have on those issues. But on the same time, we wanted to know, okay, what is the actual situation in South Africa? What is the situation in post-colonial societies about anti-Semitism, about also to a certain extent about racism, which of course probably will still exist a lot after apartheid in South Africa, and what are the promoters of anti-Semitism in South Africa, who are, how it affects the Jewish community, how is it being, what role does it play from, for example, in the ANC, or the general discourse in South Africa, in the government, in the opposition, and so on. So these are some of the questions we want to discuss in the conversation. And as I mentioned, we have 3 speakers today from very different perspectives. On the one hand, from the Jewish community, Karen, you, then Klaas, you deal with peace initiatives and working towards stability in Africa, also in connection with work with Israel, as far as I understood. And you, Benji, your main focus is on the work on Connect South Africa, South African Jews with Israel, to work also for coexistence between Israel and its neighbors and the Palestinians. So to start maybe with you, Karen, what would you say are the current main challenges of anti-Semitism in South Africa, and what is how someone can imagine the Jewish community in South Africa? How big is it? Which role does it play? How is it positioned in the society?
Great, thanks very much, Kim, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this panel. I'm very honored to be here. So I'm going to start answering actually your second question first, just to give you a sense of the Jewish community in South Africa. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a minute to describe the organization I'm from, to really understand my words in context. So I'm the chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, which has been in existence for over 100 years in South Africa. And the core mandate of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies is to protect the civil rights of Jews in South Africa. And that's been its mandate that's gone on since that time. And part of that mandate is that we're a democratically elected body that also is mandated to represent the Jewish community to the South African government. So anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism is part of our core mandate. So that just explains who I am and where I'm coming from in terms of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Let me tell you a little bit maybe about the South African Jewish community, very kind of high level, but the South African community is it's a small community, and it's been shrinking over the last few years. And I think the best way to think about the South African Jewish community is it's a tiny minority within a minority. So the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of South African Jews are white. And I mention race because obviously if we're talking in a post-apartheid context, race plays a very important role still in South Africa. So we're a small minority of a minority in South Africa. We probably, and numbers differ, but the current figures probably place us around 55,000 to 60,000 Jews in South Africa, which is quite a substantial drop from our heights, which was over 100,000 Jews in South Africa. So it is a small community, but it's certainly a very vibrant and vocal, and I'm sure Benji will mention this, also a very strongly Zionist community. It's spread between 3 main metros in South Africa, which are Johannesburg. The majority of Jews live in Johannesburg. Quite a substantial portion live in Cape Town, and a small minority of Jews live in Durban, with a very small scattering of Jews beyond that. So that kind of gives you a sense of, I suppose, our community. As I said, it's a it's a pretty united community and a very vibrant community, despite the small numbers. And I'm very welcome to take follow-up questions if there's anything else you want to know specifically about the community, but I want to go on to your next question, which I think is more core, which is, where are the threats on anti-Semitism coming from in South Africa? And perhaps to give you an indication of that, perhaps I can give you some statistics on anti-Semitism in South Africa. So South African anti-Semitism, in terms of actual incidences of anti-Semitism, has actually, oddly enough, one of the lowest rates of anti-Semitism in the world. And I can give you an example. If we look at the last few years, in 2011, for example, we had 43 recorded incidences. In 2013, we had 46 recorded incidences. We go to 2014, and I'll come back to this in a moment, we had 172 recorded incidences. And you'll notice 2014 corresponds to a major war in Gaza. So it starts to present a picture of what kind of threats there are and when anti-Semitism rises in South Africa. If we go through to 2020, we had a little bit of a rise. We had 69 reports of anti-Semitism. And if I come to this year, the total number of anti-Semitic incidences in South Africa from January to October was 65, but 31, almost half of them, occurred in May, which again was when there was an incursion into Gaza. So what we're seeing is, for me, the picture, and I can share later if anybody's interested, I can share how we've plotted the anti-Semitism statistics. There's a very, very clear mapping between incidences of anti-Semitism in South Africa, which spike whenever there is any kind of issue or war in Israel. So that's our first challenge, is that Southern Jews tend to bear the brunt in our own communities, or not bear the brunt, but certainly experience anti-Semitism whenever there is mass media or whenever there's a major conflict happening, or even a minor conflict happening in Israel. So that's where we found the one threat. The second, and that is a threat which in my view is quite strongly driven by BDS, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there are a number of examples where the BDS movement in South Africa has been explicitly and openly anti-Semitic. The third threat in terms of anti-Semitism, which is rising at the moment, is the way in which our government has been engaging on the Israel issue. That the government adheres very strongly to a two-state solution, but it also, in its own rhetoric, and many of the government ministers, has taken a very strongly anti-Israel stance. And again, what happens is we can map rising in anti-Semitic rhetoric, not anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric rises whenever we find a government minister or a member of government taking an anti-Israel stance. And the Jewish community feel very vulnerable when the government takes such a strong one-sided view on Israel. So that's a kind of growing threat, I think, to the Jewish community, is the hostility that the community is experiencing from the government. We also have some right-wing anti-Semitism. We do get it from both sides. This is historically, there is a strong right-wing white supremacist organizations in South Africa. They come and go. I think they were quiet for a while in the immediate post-apartheid time. They are resurfacing at a very fringe level, but very, very violent anti-Semitic rhetoric coming through, and they have very strong international ties to other white supremacist organizations. So we're seeing the threat coming from both sides.
Thank you very much. Klaas, when you hear like the description from the Jewish community about the situation in South Africa, and from your background and the work you're doing with your organization, what would you say, like your take of anti-Semitism in South Africa? What would you say, what you most notice from your work you're doing, which are maybe challenges you're facing? You mentioned when we discussed in advance that you traveled to Israel several times. How was perception of this? And what would you say is, which are those groups in South Africa, from your take, which are the most friendliest to towards the Jewish community, and which are more hostile ones?
Thank you so much, Kim, for inviting me to this webinar. Obviously, there are a number of things that are happening in the country, and obviously, I think we end up having anti-Semitism in the country because of the word apartheid. So the so-called anti-Israel organizations love using the apartheid narrative, obviously, to buy people in. So what they'll do, obviously, is to get into university spaces, high school, or get to the news outlet and preach the word apartheid. Then obviously the South African population will get those news. The South African population will get to hear the side of the story from the anti-Israel organizations. And when they hear that, they will actually capture that, and they will actually grasp it and sort of believe what they've been told. Because being told that Israel's an apartheid state is more believable, because of these guys, they sort of play their cards very well. They make sure that they do research. They go to areas that they know that are predominantly Black and struggling from poverty and stuff like that. So this organization, obviously, when they pick an area, they look at areas that are full of Black guys, Black communities, I mean. And the reason they do that is because they know that the Black communities will relate well with the apartheid narrative. And when they get to the Black communities, they preach this thing, this apartheid narrative. Then what happens is that as a Black person, you get to believe what they're saying. Then later on, you take it upon yourself to sort of boycott Israel or sanction Israel without even doing any research. For example, in university campuses, they will focus on student leaders, whether you're leading in student government or you're leading in like your school councils. They will focus on those young leaders, and they will give them a lesson about Israel being an apartheid state, and the young leaders won't have time to actually research. They'll actually take it as it is and believe. Then what they will do is that the young leaders on campuses, they will start chanting anti-Semitic rhetoric, or they will be having anti-Semitic placards. So they'll start easily by saying, no, we don't want Israeli academics on our campuses. They'll start pushing that agenda on campus because of what they've been told, that Israel is an apartheid state. Then they'll say, no, we don't want any Israeli artists to come perform on our campus. Then from there, it's going to move to a point where, like, no, we don't want any Jewish organizations on our campus to have events because these Jewish organizations subscribe to Zionism, and we believe that Zionism is racism. So what they will do is that they'll try to link it in a way. Then they will start saying, no, we don't welcome Jewish students on our campus. Then as time goes on, you start seeing graffiti on the walls written, one Jew, one bullet, kill the Jews or kill the farmer, stuff like that, kill a Zionist, kill a Jew. they'll be singing songs on campus saying, no, kill the Jews. Then it started easily as an apartheid narrative, then it overlapped and it boiled up now to something big, which led to anti-Semitism. And the very same young leaders, when they have protests, maybe when they're joining the anti-Israel organizations, they'll be in spaces where they'll just choose a Jewish area and they'll decide to sort of block maybe retail stores. Some go to an extent of taking a pig head and putting it by the kosher section. So it goes beyond the apartheid narrative. So what I can tell you is that it started easily when these guys just come on campus, they just talk to young people and talk about Israel being an apartheid state, then they know that the young people interpret it the way they want to interpret it. It has been challenging because it's hard to come from a point of defense. For example, being from a point of defense, now you still have to clarify why it's not an apartheid state. Because I'm from Africans for Peace. As an organization, our aim is to educate. Our aim is sort of champion the interests of everyone in the Middle East. What are we trying to do is sort of build bridges. And these bridges are the ones that are going to bring about peace. And what we're trying to show the world and show especially the South African population is that, look, South Africa is where it is because Blacks and whites were willing to sit down and negotiate. They were willing to sit down and discuss the issues that they had at the time. But what we can do as an organization is to try by all means to bring all the parties in the Middle East together. So it hasn't been easy because sometimes when you get into university campuses, we are confronted by the students that were already captured by the BDS or by the Africa for Palestine organizations. And sometimes when you get into these Black communities already, when you try to speak to the people or the young leaders in the communities, already they will be captured as well by the anti-Israel organization. So for you to sort of get that platform, it's becoming a big challenging because of already these guys have a narrative, they have something they believe in. So, but the aim is always to get to the people in the communities, in the university space, in the school space, and educate them about the conflict in the Middle East, educate them about what's really going down, and get to make people to be aware of their words, because their words matter. So you can't, as a young leader, you can't just go out there and spread lies. You can't go out there and speak bad about a certain state that you don't really understand much about it. So what we need to do is to sort of educate these young leaders to get to understand what's happening in the Middle East and get to give them clarity.
Thank you very much. And we will come back to some of the points you mentioned later on. Benji, like in your work or if you reflect on the relationship between South Africa and Israel and the possibilities of South African Jews speaking openly about Israel, their friendships there and so on, what would be like your take on describing the situation currently in South Africa? On the one hand, in the public discourse, and on the other hand, on the government level.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So I think what's useful to understand about the South African experience with this issue is that it's primarily, when we're having these discussions, is within a elite context of the country, right? So the majority of South Africans are not interested in this topic, or if they are interested, they might very well be predisposed towards Israel because of religious belief or cultural connection and that sort of thing. So for example, we have data from the University of Cape Town, where we did research into Black communities in urban parts of South Africa. And they found that 75% of all the respondents that they spoke to were not aware that there is a fight going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Didn't even know it existed at 75%. That's an enormously high number for something which gets a lot of airtime and a lot of discussion in South Africa. So how do you square that off? So I think what it is that, again, the majority of South Africans don't know, don't care, are not especially engaged with this. But the elite part of the society, so the media, academia, trade unions, the government, some forms of NGOs, are, for ideological reasons, very, very connected to this issue. And that means that it gets discussed very often in the public discourse, even though in a way that is far more prominent than any other international relations issue on our agenda. And South Africa has a few, but nothing gets more airtime than that. And it has to do with the ideology of some of the main players in the society, and some history as well, that makes this the case. Now, for the Jewish community, essentially the Jewish community is an elite community within the society, from the perspective of the fact that it is relatively well off economically, that it's well educated, that it has access to various resources in and of itself. And because of that, you will find Jews in all of these elite institutions in the society, in the media, in the arts, in academia, in parts of the government, etc. And so when you get the issues around Israel coming up, and because the Jewish community is very Zionistic, I mean, the Zionist Federation is the first organization that is ever created in a national level in the country. And so it goes back very, very far. You find that those Jews then rub up against the more anti-Israel and sometimes very anti-Semitic parts of the elite parts of the society. And I would contrast this with, say, parts of Eastern Europe, for example, where you find governments and parts of the society now that are relatively pro-Israel, pro-Jewish because of history. But if you go down a level and speak to the person on the street, there you find very crude, problematic forms of anti-Semitism. In the South African context, it's kind of swapped. Our elites have a problem with anti-Semitism, and your general population actually is relatively well disposed towards Jews and to Israel as well.
Thank you very much, Karen. If you, from a South African Jewish perspective, hear like claims that Israel is behaving like, or is an apartheid state, what does it make with you? And also, how does the whole claim affect the Jewish community? Also in the sense that I can imagine it's not a very easy situation that something where those more progressive people who were against apartheid, were opposing apartheid, now are being maybe also claimed that they are supporting apartheid, but like the Israeli one. Yeah.
Thanks. I think it's a really important question, because I think that anti-Israel sentiment is problematic around the world, but the apartheid analogy falls particularly strongly and hard and resonates very hard within a South African context. So, and I think really Klaas, thank you Klaas for explaining so much of this so well in terms of how that analogy gets passed through various levels of organization and becomes uncritically accepted as the dominant narrative. So as Klaas said, it's kind of to some extent uncritically accepted within the leadership of these organizations as the dominant narrative. What happens then, I think, is that you get a race dynamic emerging. So it's very difficult for white South Africans, and particularly people of my age, to argue around an apartheid analogy when it's very clear and very obvious that we are the people who benefited from apartheid. And as white South Africans, there's a difficult dynamic there. But for me, it goes beyond that, in that I think that the two issues that are used particularly strongly in relation to Israel. The first, obviously, is the apartheid state, which, as I've said already, resonates strongly in South Africa. And the second, this notion that Zionism is racism. And I think that when you have a clarion call, for example, if you're at a university and there's a huge banner across the steps of the main university administration building that says Zionism is racism, you are inevitably, in my view, placing people who feel some attachment to Israel, which, you know, and remember, nobody has a very nuanced view on Zionism. So kind of nobody defines what they mean as a Zionist. But when you say things like Zionism is racism and Israel is an apartheid state, you are automatically removing Jews in South Africa who have a connection to Israel and who feel a relationship with Israel. You're removing them from the community of the good, from the community of non-racists. And in my view, that places us at risk, because particularly in South Africa, the idea of racism is and should be an anathema. So to be called a racist, to be identified as a racist because of your identity, creates enormous vulnerability on the part of the Jewish community. It's a vile thing to be. And so it's both extremely hurtful to the community and also dangerous to the community.
Thank you for sharing these insights. Klaas, when you work or when you do the work you're doing together with Jewish organization, together with other organizations, what is the perception in your environment, the people you know, friends, or like outside organization? Is it something easy to work on, or is it more something it's a little bit frightening or challenging at least?
It's actually challenging because the moment you sort of appear in public with a different view being that Israel's not an apartheid state, and they ask you why, you say, no, I've been there, then it raises eyebrows to some of the organizations that are pro-Palestine or are anti-Israel. They'll be like, no, you were bought. You were bought by the Zionists. So there's that perception that, no, you can't think independently as a Black man in the country without being bought. So you are siding with the whites, and they always find a way to break it down so that it appears as if you are sort of a sellout. They're like, no, yes, you are taking a side of an oppressor. You are siding with the white South Africans. You are siding with the colonizers. So they try by all means to make you feel very, very bad, and until they give you a platform to explain why Israel is not an apartheid state, then they get to see. Because I always tell the people that I sort of encounter in these discussions or in debates that, look, to allow these organizations to call Israel an apartheid state is actually an insult to our history as South Africans, as Black South Africans. These organizations are undermining what our parents and our grandparents have been through. Our parents went through the most. They couldn't vote, they couldn't be in political formations, they couldn't go to the same schools as whites, they couldn't be seated in certain areas, they couldn't marry white. There were a lot of things that they couldn't do during apartheid. And you go to the Middle East, you go to Israel, you realize actually this is not the same. And to come back to South Africa to explain that, you have to break it down for this organization, for these other individuals, especially my closest friends, because I'm in a political space where most of my friends are activists and are leaning towards being anti-Israel because of what they've been taught. Most of them haven't been to the Middle East, but sort of because of what they see in the media. And our problem is that the South African media preaches anti-Israel a lot. So the anti-Israel rhetoric is preached most of the time on our news and stuff like that. So the aim here is sort of to educate them. I keep telling them, look, this is an insult, and you cannot allow this organization to keep insulting our history like that. Because in Israel, there's no such a thing as apartheid. It's never the same. who have expressed it. You can do research on your own, and you can get to actually exploit. We don't have to take you to Israel for you to see it. You can actually do history and check if Arabs can vote, check if Palestinians can walk freely in that land. Can you check if Arabs can go to the same universities or same schools as the Jews, or same hospitals? Can they be on the same bus? You know, stuff like that. You do research on your own and get to establish your own facts without being spoon-fed lies.
Thank you. I was wondering when over the last years, when I followed a little bit of news in South Africa, I saw there were some notices on some news on terror organizations like the PFLP, individuals being active there, fundraising for BDS, for example, or also that parts of the government were meeting with Hamas officials, like welcoming them to South Africa. Benji, can you a little bit explain like what kind of positioning between like terror organization, the South African government, and other organization exists, and how this plays like into real world experience? Let's say it's having a terrorist organization being welcomed by a government or other organization. Of course, it's not the nicest thing. So if you can explain a little bit what is going on there.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think a few things in terms of understanding the discourse around the idea of terrorism in South Africa. So the first is that historically, the party that runs South Africa, the African National Congress, the ANC, had a working relationship with the PLO under the Cold War, right? So you had, I guess for your audience, the East Germans and the PLO and the ANC, and I think maybe in some of the Spanish there was a few as well, and in Ireland. So it was that grouping that they operated on, but even before they did that, the ANC was called terrorists by the apartheid government, right? So in a South African context, even when they were not being involved with terrorist actions, I mean, what's interesting with the ANC is that when they used to go out, for example, and engage in military actions, they didn't take weapons, at least at the beginning. So there was a particular focus on saving civilian lives in the anti-apartheid struggle, but nonetheless they were called terrorists by the government at the time. So to be called a terrorist in South Africa is not really seen as a particularly bad thing. Basically the terrorists won, if you can think about it as the history of the country, because the ANC won. So terrorism is not a particularly a dirty word, unlike the way it might be in America or Europe, or certainly Israel. The other aspect which has been very important is that from a perspective of violent terrorism acts, South Africa has been relatively unaffected. There was terrorism in the early 90s in Cape Town. That was a bit of an issue. And we have had attempts at terrorism that we know about that have got out into the public, but nothing that's ever been successful so far, which is positive. But we know that there have been attempts of terrorism on South Africa, but it's never actually occurred. And that again sort of breeds a sense of complacency around the discourse, where people think that it can't happen in South Africa, even though we are well aware, and if you do research into this, you will find that terrorist organizations, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, any of these groups use South Africa less as a target place, although they sometimes do that, but more as a place where you can move funds, where you can recruit people, where you can organize yourselves, because we have a society that's free and open, but at the same time, it's also has many lax government loopholes. The police are not effective. The intelligence services are engaged in sort of political issues as opposed to looking at intelligence issues. So So it's an easy place for terror operations to operate without actually going to the extent of blowing anything up, so to speak. So that is the context. Now, what then happens is that the government tends to just identify anyone that is, particularly in the context of Israel, seen as being the most extreme, as being the most appropriate people to sort of hold up the mantle of the resistance. They don't see it as terrorism, they see it as resistance. So it would sort of make sense, even though they had a long relationship with the PLO, and they still do have a very good relationship with the PLO. Me as a South African taxpayer, I pay for the Palestinian embassy to operate in Pretoria because my government pays for it. But it also creates room for the ANC. They don't do it at a government level because I think that would bring certain diplomatic problems. But what they do is the ANC will invite someone like Hamas to the country and will engage with them. And because of the way that the ANC operates, it's almost indivisible from the government itself. So they can get away with engaging a group like Hamas with its horrendous anti-Semitism and its terror links and all of these sorts of things. But they don't make it sort of, it's officially non-official, the cooperation with these sorts of groups. And of course, then you will have groups connected to the BDS that will then glorify terrorist operations. So, for example, we recently had a young South African who was murdered in Israel at the Jerusalem at the wall there in Jerusalem, and the discourse that was coming out from some of the BDS connected organizations was that this was an act of resistance, that this was a heroic act, that this person should be lionized, that sort of thing. So that is the sort of dynamic around how terrorism and terror organizations operate, and that they operate freely from a logistical perspective. We haven't had yet any actual violent threats, not for a long time, and I hope that continues. But it's in a political discourse, it doesn't raise the same kind of red flags that it might do in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Now I want to ask the three of you about the two individuals I mentioned in the past, if you want to comment on it, about the the vision or your view on Farid Isaac and Shulman Mbembe, and the connection with anti-Semitism and Israel hatred or boycotts against Israel and Israeli academics. Karen, do you want to start maybe?
So I'm not that familiar. We deal primarily with internal issues around the Jewish community. So I think I'm going to leave it to my colleagues, if that's okay, and the other panelists to respond. Thank you.
Sure. Klaas, are you, like in your work or what you observe, did you somehow notice the work of Farid Isaac and Mbembe in South Africa, or didn't it play such a huge role?
No, it didn't play any role in my life. In our organization as well, we haven't really encountered them yet. Okay, that's fine. So Benji, I know that you did some work and where that you were able to explain a little bit the situation in South Africa and the role of the two people. So I might ask you at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So I think that if you mention individuals by name like that in a South African context, they're not going to raise a particular not many. It's not like a famous outside of specific community. Particularly Mbembe is a famous academic, but he's famous academically. And for example, I know that Klaas's organization, he might want to come back on this, that he may never have heard of Farid Isaac, but he would definitely have heard of Africa for Palestine, or what used to be called BDSSA. And maybe you can comment on that, because that's really the organization that Farid Isaac runs. And that would be the thing that most people would recognize, not the names of individual people. So in terms of Fareed Essek and BDSSA and Africa for Palestine, there's a few interesting elements there. It's certainly one of the organizations that's been the most prominent in spreading Israel-related anti-Semitism, or as we like to call it, anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. So, for example, the director of that organization, and this is on the public record, he went to there was an Israeli pianist or Israeli jazz singer at an event on the university campus that Klaas is at, and the crowd outside was chanting "Kill the Jew" in a local vernacular language, and it was their event and their process, and they never and protest, and they never responded to it. The same organization Klaas mentioned about the pig head in the kosher section of a store down in Cape Town, same organization. And so that organization that Fareed Essek has headed has been responsible for a lot of anti-Semitic incidents in the community or against the community, and interestingly has an interesting dynamic within the Palestinian groups here as well. So it's a very public incident that happened in South Africa a few years ago, where a Palestinian delegation came to South Africa to engage in I don't exactly know what they would do. I think they would have some kind of a conference, and one of the women in that delegation accused the director of Essek's organization of sexual harassment, and essentially the organization didn't really react to it. They didn't lay any kind of complaint. They did some sort of internal engagement with that topic, and then cleared the director, and that caused an enormous rift within the Solidarity Alliance, within the Palestinian groupings, to the extent that that organization, Fareed's organization, actually is no longer recognized by groups like the World BDS movement, and you don't have to trust me on this, the people like Omar al-Baghuti, who is the head of the whole BDS movement. He actually put out a big public video saying that this organization doesn't even represent sort of genuine Palestinian interests in South Africa because of this incident. So it is a controversial organization. They had to rebrand, but it is still very active in a number of spaces. And so that's where I think most people would have encountered Fareed Essek's work, if not his organization. Achille Mbembe is an interesting story, a different one. He is a famous academic in South Africa. He has written a number of books and articles and things which are anti-Israel, and he also fully endorses boycotts against Israeli academics. So there was a case a few years ago in the University of Stellenbosch, which is in the Western Cape here in South Africa, where they were having a peace conference, and it was peace and looking at issues of reparation, issues of colonialism, and a number of Israeli presenters were invited, as well as a Palestinian presenter, all of whom were engaged on the topic of how do we bring about reconciliation in post-colonial context, how do we engage the other, and all who were actually very highly critical of the Israeli government. And Achille Mbembe signed a letter saying that those people should be removed from the conference. And ultimately they chose to withdraw, including the Palestinian academic, rather than come face that kind of hostile issue in an academic conference. So I think Achille Mbembe's views are well known, and I think that they're not, as he likes to claim, I think that they're peaceful or engaged or anything like that. I think the fact that he was prepared to sign off against Palestinians and Israelis who he essentially just didn't agree with, who wouldn't hold his line, I think says something about his commitment to academic freedom and to how far he's prepared to go on this particular issue when it comes to this. And for those that think that these sorts of actions do constitute anti-Semitism, and certainly if you're looking at definitions like IHRA, for example, certainly meets those criteria in my view. So that is where I think it should sits in this particular discussion. I mean, Klaas, maybe given this, maybe you have some more thoughts on BDS South Africa or some of the people engaged, they might give the viewers something else extra to engage on.
Yeah, actually, it only rang now that my last TV debate, national TV debate, I was supposed to actually to debate Farouk Isaac, and he couldn't come, so they had to replace him with another person in the country. BDS South Africa is mainly known on campuses. It's not known in the townships or in the communities that much. The reason they're known on campuses is because of their branding is targeted towards the students. So what they do mainly, because now obviously they're to rebrand to Africa for Palestine, what they do is to obviously plan. The plan here is that we need to reach a policy, a South African policy, national policy or government policy, sidelining Israel. So they know that it's going to take time to actually get there. You don't just walk to the government and expect the government to actually write up a policy and say we're going to downgrade the South African embassy in Israel into a liaison office. What they will do is to sort of get active young leaders on campuses. They will indoctrinate them, spread lies, sort of fund their campaigns. They fund their campaigns because they know that, look, this person today is a leader in the school. After being a leader in the school, this person is going to be a student leader in the student government or the student representative council. When they're a leader there, they're most likely to be a leader again in their political parties. When they're a leader in their political parties, they're going to end up being a leader in their communities. From there, they're going to be a leader in their province. Then from there, they end up being in parliament. When they're in parliament, that's where the policies get passed. And those policies that are passed in parliament, normally they started at the Congress level. So if they manage to get at least 200 young leaders, activists who are on their payroll or who are on their side, when they go to a conference, national conference of a certain political parties, and there's this issue that always comes up, because there's always issues that come out, like there's always issue about land, nationalization, and free education. Then there's always this issue of international relation. And obviously those leaders that were being captured in that particular space, whenever they're in that conference, they'll be preaching that, no, let's sideline Israel. Let's downgrade the South African embassy in Tel Aviv to actually have it as and bring back our ambassador and just have that as a liaison office. It starts then the political party passes that. After they pass that, then we go to election, the political party wins. They win, then it gets to a parliament. Now it gets to be debated in parliament. So they start like that. So they work like that. And now, obviously, they work also with the media guys. So like, look, we start with the students who are in the journalism class. They sort of capture them. They sort of indoctrinate them as well. They know that one day these guys are going to be writing, are going to be presenting news that are sort of favorable to us. As much as it's lies, but they don't care. As much as people, the South African population is going to be fed with lies and people are going to sort of feed from that information. So they use a lot of tactics. And whenever whenever organizations like Africans for Peace or any other Black guys that are actually against them come in public and debate or come in public and sort of disagree with them, they use that narrative, they use that ticket that, look, you are bought, you are paid and stuff like that. So, but we always do it. We always come out and we always disagree with them to make sure that we clarify the whole South Africa about the things that they are up to and the things that they are doing.
Thank you for this insight. Before opening questions to the public, and you can, if you have any question, you can write it in the chat already. I would like to ask the three of you, South Africa has been hit the coronavirus pandemic quite strongly. So how does this affect the living conditions in general and anti-Semitism and racism in South Africa? Maybe we can start with you, Karen.
Thanks very much. So you're quite right. South Africa has been very severely hit by corona, by the COVID virus. And like minorities around the world, the South African Jewish community has actually been quite disproportionately affected by COVID. I think that, and the South African economy has really taken enormous strain as a result of COVID. Going back right to the beginning of COVID, we've had some quite severe lockdowns, and there really is no security, there's very little security net for South Africans. So when the country effectively shuts down, it affects the formal economy in terms of people, the formal businesses being very severely affected, but there's an entire informal economy as well that is dependent on people traveling to work, being able to access places of work, etc., which has been very, very severely affected. So it's been a genuine tragedy, I think, for the South African economy, which has been really exacerbated now, where the South African scientists, and I want to state this very clearly, South African scientists identified the Omicron virus. It did not originate in South Africa. But because it was South African scientists who identified the virus, as soon as they alerted the world, as I think is the responsibility of scientists, to the fact that they had identified this new variant, countries around the world immediately shut their borders to South Africa. And it's important to note that this is our tourist season. So in shutting their borders to South Africa, they've effectively destroyed the South African tourist industry. As you can hear, I feel very passionate and very emotional about it. I think it is a classic example, actually, of xenophobia and of anti-African racism, that the Omicron virus, which was clearly already evident in countries in Europe, and perhaps, I'm not sure about America, but was certainly evident in Europe, that because the news had come out of Africa, and we've seen some very racist cartoon as well in some of the European newspapers about this virus emanating from Africa, which does not seem to be correct. So from that point of view, this country's taken a real beating. We would really like our government to focus on, I think, what is important. And we've taken a beating around a couple of other things. So we're getting back to, in some ways we're bouncing back, in other ways we're still struggling. And I think that we'd really like to see our government focusing on really the key issues that affect the population in South Africa, who are really suffering under the current situation with the virus.
Thank you. Klaas, what is your take now from the living conditions you noticed during the corona pandemic, and also about like, at least in Europe, there are also some rumors which connect kind of conspiracy theories that the coronavirus comes from the Jews, might come from Israel, things like this. And the vaccines are also sometimes being seen as an evil thing. The vaccination process in Europe, at least, also sometimes associated with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Did you come around such things in South Africa as well?
South Africa, so obviously when the hard lockdown was sort of implemented last year, 2020, the public sort of complied. We understood that we were faced with a big virus that needs collective, they like need us as a collective to fight against. And when the government told us that we need to be indoors for 21 days, we stayed indoors, we didn't do anything. It was like, because we had like from level 5, then level 4, level 3, level 2, until level 1, and advanced level 1, you know. So the communities were sort of compliant. They were like, we're going to do this. And then it happened that we moved to level 4, and now people started not taking the regulations, the lockdown regulations serious. Because the reason is that we have a lot of unemployed youth in the county, and even the graduates are unemployed in the county. So when you tell the unemployed to sit at home, not do anything, not to be on the street, try to hustle or to try to sort of make means to at least put food on their table, what are you expecting from them? And I can tell you that since then, we had, like I remember, even in 2021, this year, we had riots where people were fed up. People were very angry, and the communities, especially in the townships. I'm from a township called Soweto, where people were angry and decided to actually started looting the stores. So they ended up going to retail stores and decided to actually loot the food from there. They took food, they took appliances, they took clothes, a lot of stuff. And we understood as the country why they did that. People are not working, people are angry, people are also hungry. As a result, they decided to resort to that because there's no other thing. The government is not there for them. And you'll be so shocked that our government focuses its energy on the Middle East issue between Israel and Palestine. Recently, Miss South Africa was supposed to be going to, before she left, she was supposed to be going to contest for Miss University in Israel. Then what happened is that the government, all of a sudden, our Minister of Arts and Culture, who was quite old the whole time, is out there commenting that she shouldn't go. Now we see the government writing statement that she shouldn't go. And we're shocked as a country that why were you so quiet all along when people are saying we don't have money, people are saying we don't have jobs, we don't have food, you are quiet. But now there's this issue of Israel, why are you prioritizing this issue? So we haven't had I haven't had in the communities where I'm from, we haven't had any anti-Semitic sort of rhetoric when it comes to the vaccine or when it comes to the coronavirus. The only thing that we had was obviously propaganda information that the 5G causes coronavirus. But what was actually said was that the rich people actually are the ones who brought coronavirus, because coronavirus was in China, was somewhere in Italy, then people traveled to Italy and they came back to South Africa with it and everyone suffered. But we just said the rich people, they didn't say any Jewish people actually brought it up. When it comes to vaccine, people are still saying, no, we're not going to vaccinate just because of their beliefs. They feel like the government wants to put a chip in them so they can track their movement. They feel like the vaccine is from the devil because of the information that was spread around. But it's not really linked to the Jews in the country. Especially where I'm from, people just don't want to vaccinate because they feel like it's not going to help them anyhow because they can still survive without the vaccine. So what's the need for them to actually be vaccinating? Yeah.
Thank you. Benji, what do you have something to add on the question of anti-Semitism, racism developments during the Corona pandemic? Do you have some further observations?
I think that most of it has been covered by the other speakers. Unlike Europe, we have a very young population, and this virus tends to affect much more elderly people. So I think that as a Jewish community, which has a slightly older profile than the rest of the country, we've had proportionately a lot of health issues, but the community infrastructure has been very good at being able to combat that. So we were able to shut down, for example, our old age homes very quickly before it became a real problem. So that's been good. I think the economic issue is probably the bigger one. We have 40% unemployment rate at the moment. And when it gets to youth level, I think that gets to 50 or 60%, something like that. So these sorts of economic interventions are much more of a problem. Our vaccine coverage is only about 35%. And that's down to some of what Klaas has been talking about in terms of hesitancy and also in logistics of getting the vaccines out. I will say that I saw something from the German government saying that tourists are welcome to come to South Africa still. So Kim, if you want to come for a holiday, or anybody else watching, we get a lot of German tourists over this period, and we have a very large German population here. I think the number of Germans actually outnumbers the numbers of Jews in South Africa. So if you do come here, you'll have a good holiday and you'll help the economy as well. And so I'm just saying you should come. Cape Town's lovely this time of year.
Thank you. We have one question to Klaas from the audience, which reads, I will read it. Have you been successful occasionally with your argument that calling Israel an apartheid state is a distortion of actual apartheid history in anti-racist contexts in South Africa?
Yeah, whenever I obviously encounter that, especially people will say Israel's an apartheid state, what we do is that we draw a parallel, we sort of do the comparison. We show them why it's not an apartheid, and we, at the end, we conclude that it's actually a conflict. Because when you go to Israel, when you go to the Knesset, the Israel parliament, we have Arabs there. In the South African parliament, we never had blacks in parliament until later on, where we had what we call the tricameral government, where they only included the Asians and then the so-called colors, the mixed race. But we never really had a black representative. We never really had what do you call the Supreme Court judge as a black person back in the days. But we had in Israel, we had an Arab as a judge. So we sort of show them, there are a number of things. When you go to Tel Aviv University, you find Arab there. Back in the days, there were universities only for blacks and universities only for the whites. Schools, hospitals, buses, sporting codes, a lot of things you can list. We show them, look, apartheid was actually a system of laws and was actually architected proper, was sort of architectured. They were talking about the housing, where the housing law, Mixed Marriages Act. There were a lot of things, there were a lot of laws that were sort of written down to sort of prevent the black communities from being involved in this country. So when you go to the Middle East, we don't have those laws that are actually preventing the Arabs from taking part in the government activities. So we show them, and that's why we always sort of become successful, because we're arguing with people that don't have facts. They're just spreading propaganda, and sometimes they're not even willing to sort of discuss. All they do is to shout, all they do is to chant, all they do is sort of make noise in public, and they don't want to give you platform, because they know that the moment you give them platform, the moment they give you platform, they sort of lose their credibility, because we have more facts. We have facts from the ground. We have spoken to Palestinians, and they actually told us what they need. Most of the Palestinians don't even recognize the organizations that are here. We've spoken to business people in Palestine, and they tell you that no, we don't recognize such organizations, because they are costing us, they're costing our economy. They're not really doing that in the interest of paramount interest of us as Palestinians.
Thank you. Here is another question or comment, which says the rise of extremist nationalist parties has become global. Is the anti-Semitic speech National Party of South Africa's anti-Semitic is way okay. Okay, the question has been removed, but I think the question was a little bit about what you mentioned before, Karen, that in a global context, like white supremacist and racist movement became more important over the last couple of years, also being reflected in the US. with a certain person there, and also being reflected in Europe, for example, in some countries where more authoritarian, racist, nationalist discourse got stronger. Karen, what would you say, or when you look at the South African context, do you have the feeling that all these international debates are being reflected in South Africa, or is it more independent of this international context and US context?
They are being reflected in South Africa, but as always with its own South African taste, if I can put it that way. So what we're seeing in South Africa, for example, is there's a movement, and I'm not quite sure the full extent of the movement, but a movement called Stop White Genocide in South Africa. What that refers to is the fact that there have been large, as part of the very high crime rate in South Africa, there have been a large number of murders which have taken place on farms and which have killed farmers who are predominantly white in South Africa. But the statistics are largely taken out of context and are being entirely misrepresented, and I say this quite categorically, are entirely misrepresented as some kind of white genocide. But what we're finding is that within the Stop White Genocide movement, which is primarily about addressing farm murders, but definitely incorporates very, very high level of strong right-wing white supremacist anti-Semitism. So within all these groups, we see classic, if I can put it that way, classic right-wing anti-Semitism coming through. And it's not just that the international white supremacist philosophies and views are coming through into South Africa, it's also that they're seeing the Stop White Genocide movement as a space that they can operate in, that international organizations can take up the cause. So every now and then you get these guys going overseas and presenting their case to these very far right-wing populist white supremacist organizations. So their target in South Africa is not necessarily Jews. Their target in South Africa is typically a very basic racist target. But if you go into any of their groups, they are absolutely filled with vicious, vicious right-wing anti-Semitism.
Thank you. We have a last question, then I would close the questions. It says, or I read it, it's a sentence and the question, thank you. And internationally, in Black Lives Matter context or so, if this is a context you're working in. So I will frame it a little bit differently. Like internationally, we have seen strong protests against racism and anti-Black police brutality. Like if I remember well, some of the iconics being used from the Black Lives Matter context, like people being killed or shot by the police, were sometimes also equated in South Africa with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. With some images, but maybe you can extend on this. And in general, what is the perception of the Black Lives Matter movement, like in the US, but also globally, in the South African context? And does it play any role that like central organizations there are calling to boycott Israel, for example, and the Israelis? Okay, I would start with Benji, and then turn to Klaas, and then to Karen for this question.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think that it's in some ways very similar to what Karen was saying around some of the white identity politics that we've got coming to South Africa. It sort of plays a part, but in our own kind of a context. So you will have, for example, so Black Lives Matter was a big deal here, but maybe the biggest thing was around the issue of kneeling, right? So the cricket team here was instructed to kneel in a similar way to Black Lives Matter, and one of the cricketers didn't want to do that, and then there was like a whole fight around that, and that was the big debate around Black Lives Matter. It does have an impact, I would say, in certain kinds of communities, and there is a discussion around it. What I would say is the kinds of communities that are engaged in a discussion around Black Lives Matter are also likely to be the kinds of sort of maybe very academic communities or activist class that already pretty much decided their view ideologically on the Israel issue. And whilst you might get some of that feedback loop of the comparisons between Black Lives Matter and Israel, I think in a South African context, it doesn't quite translate to that. I think that in any case, the kind of people who are talking about Black Lives Matter are probably already not normally very pro-Israel to begin with, and I'm not sure that it sort of has. I wouldn't say that's the main discourse issue on it. I haven't followed it that closely, so but that's just my impression of how it sort of gets dealt with here.
Klaas, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think we are at a level, or we are living in a generation where people sort of believe in this thing called intersectionality. Because of your rights are being infringed, I'm going to support you. Then when I sort of chant or sort of go out there publicly and say something, you're going to have to, in return, come support me as well. So we had issues obviously about Black Lives Matter in the country, but they're not that big. We didn't really channel our energy as much as the Black communities here. It was mainly on social media, and we didn't really have many marches or demonstrations on the streets. People tried to do that. Some did, yes, but it wasn't really as big as other demonstrations that we normally have, especially when it comes to service delivery. And it becomes a problem because now when people are sort of talking about police brutality, then obviously there's going to be people from the anti-Israel organization jumping and say, no, yeah, while we're talking about police brutality in USA or in Nigeria, there's actually brutality in Palestine perpetuated by the Israeli army. And now people are sort of losing the focus from them, they focus on that. So in South Africa, we always find ways to sort of call it out. That, guys, now we're talking about free education, free quality and decolonized education. We're not going to allow any space for you guys to bring in your agenda to talk about Israel and Palestine. This is a platform for free education. We're talking about service delivery. We haven't had electricity, or we haven't had power. We've been having regular power cuts in our township or in our communities for the past 3 weeks. We haven't had water. We haven't had service delivery when it comes to roads. And we are chanting, or we are sort of having this demonstration on the streets because of that. We're not going to allow you to come in and talk about such things. And no, the reason we don't have electricity is because of the Jews that are running the states. The Jews decide who must have the electricity. The Jews decide who must have this education. So we don't give people that platform in the country. So obviously in the States, I know it's a big thing where sort of they use that platform whenever it's Black Lives Matter march, they will use that platform to sort of bring in this topic as well. So here we find ways to sort of stop it from happening and make sure that we focus on the main issue that we are gathered there for.
Thank you. Karen, did you notice like that, like inside the Jewish community, did you notice any effects of the US discussions on the South African Jewish community, on Black Lives Matter and so on?
I mean, it's hard to comment on. I can just tell you from a kind of anecdotal view. I think that there is some broad-based support for the Black Lives Matter movement, even within the Jewish community, but with a concern around the way in which that cause has at times been hijacked for a different agenda. I think that's the best way I can describe it, is that it's not something that there's broad-based support. I think when the movements first started in America and people were horrified, I think people were horrified at the police brutality and at the reasons for the Black Lives. I think there's a lot of sympathy for the reasons for the Black Lives Matter movement. But it is, I suppose, shaded with a certain caution around the concerns that the other people have mentioned. We haven't really seen it in South Africa, and it may be because while there's sympathy and there's quite a lot of support, and as Benji said, it's recently reared its head in relation to a sporting event, it's not something that's front and center in South Africa in the way it is in the US and possibly in Europe.
Thank you. Like, as a last question to end the conversation is looking forward, looking like to the future. Where the relation or the situation of anti-Semitism, Israel hatred, racism in South Africa could stand in 5 years, in 10 years? What if you look to positive side? How could it look like? And how would it be different than today? Benji, I will start with you, then I will turn to Klaas, and finally with Karen, I will stop here. Okay.
Thank you, Kim. Look, it's a very broad question and no one really knows the future, but I think one potential path that we could see into the future is really the path that the rest of the African continent is taking with regards to its approaches to Israel. So recently, Israel was admitted into the African Union for the first time in 20 years. And there was some pushback by South Africa and Algeria to try and stop that, but they weren't really able to do so. And I think that when you talk about this issue as a post-colonial issue, our societies here require a lot of things in order to get our society correct. We have to solve big water problems. We have to solve big agriculture problems. We have to solve big problems when it comes to healthcare, with cybersecurity, with entrepreneurship. And all of these things are places where Israel excels and is very willing and interested and able, I think, in partnering with countries across Africa, including South Africa, to try and find solutions to some of the problems that are affecting Africa in general. And I think that will be an important force going forwards, the sort of practical, non-ideological force of people on the ground to say, well, we want something better for ourselves, and maybe what our contribution can be when it comes to the Palestinians is to take our example as South Africans and help promote peace and dialogue in the same way as we had in sort of 94 and getting people to come together, but that the idea that we would exclude participation and connection with Israel on the basis of our solidarity with the Palestinians, it would be detrimental to our own interests as South Africans, and that needs to come first. So I don't know what the future holds, but I think that is one possibility that people start moving in that direction.
Thank you. Klaas, what is your vision,
Yeah, I think actually as an optimist, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to be having a different approach to the Middle East conflict. We're going to be having more people that are sort of clued up on the issue. We're going to be having more people that are reading on it, are researching on it, and more people that are open to having an open discussion on it. So I believe that things are going to be very better, because the environment in itself won't be that volatile, won't be that tense like it is now. Because whenever you bring these two parties together, especially outside Israel, let's say, for example, there's a TV debate, there's always that animosity, there's always that tension. I believe in the next 5 years, things are going to be different, because the public will be aware of the things that are happening on the ground in the Middle East. And the reason I'm saying that is because of we are out there, we're getting to educate the youth, we're getting to educate the learners and the students in the university spaces and on campuses. We find ways sort of engage them, we find ways sort of expose them to the realities. And we believe that that's going to solve this racism that is going on, is going to solve the anti-Semitic approach that is being taken back. Because the aim is sort of to understand that when you are taking the South African Jews, you actually are taking the South African democracy. Democracy allows you to think different. Democracy allows you to be independent. And in that way, you need to understand that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. That's why we have independent parties in the Middle East. That's why we have independent thinkers in the Middle East. We have a lot of things that are happening in a democratic space. So we believe that the South African community will get to see that, the South African community will get to be aware of the things that are happening in the Middle East, and they'll get to conclude that it's actually, this is a conflict and it's not apartheid. So what we've been doing was actually anti-Semitic by saying, kill the Jews, and we need to change the narrative. We need to change the approach now. The approach is to build relationship with the Jewish community to sort of champion the interests of all the parties in the Middle East.
Thank you. Karen, your vision
Thanks.
about the future in South Africa.
So I think there are two points I want to make around that. The first in relation to Israel, and as I said a few times, it's not really our core mandate, but I think it is reasonable to reflect that I think many South African Jews have been heartened by a statement that was made recently by the Department of International Relations, where they spoke about a possible role for South Africa in engaging and in finding peace in the Middle East. And I think that the South African government sometimes goes along that path in terms of what we believe is a huge contribution that South Africa could make. Having found a route to peace and reconciliation within our own country, I think most of us would hope that South Africa can play a very strong role in bringing about peace in the Middle East. On the other side of that, there is huge concern that unless the government comes out more even-handed, and I do want to be clear, we'd like to see them being more even-handed. I personally reject this kind of dichotomy of you either pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian. I think you can be pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, and what we would not want the government to change their views on resolving the conflict in the Middle East in a way that finds a just solution. We'd just like to see them being more even-handed in the way they go about that, and in that way have an opportunity to participate in that. I think from an anti-Semitism point of view, just to end with very quickly, we may be at a bit of a tipping point. We've been really successful in South Africa in using the constitution and non-government organizations and organs of civil society to fight anti-Semitism wherever it's appeared. So we've won a number of court cases, most recently against a right-wing anti-Semite, and we've got a huge court case at the moment in the Constitutional Court around whether or not threats against Zionists and threats against Jews are seen as hate speech in South Africa. At the moment, as we stand now, our organs of justice and our courts have really succeeded in protecting the South African community, as our constitution, I think, foresaw as a minority in this country. We're hoping that those institutions will stand firm, but I think that we're at a tipping point. If those institutions stand firm, then from an anti-Semitism point of view, I think our future remains strong and secure.
Okay, thank you very much for the three final remarks on the vision in South Africa. Also for all your insights you mentioned on the different subjects we talked about today, on the post-colonial context, on anti-Semitism there, on the anti-Semitism, how it affects the Jewish community, the relation to Israel, the government aspect, and also the very positive dynamics to certain extents which are happening. So thank you very much for being with us. And I wish you all the best for your future work and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you for hosting us, Kim, and we really appreciate the work that great work that you do in Germany to educate people on this topic. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.